The officers moved in like a strike of lightning, no warning, no questions. In seconds, a man was cuffed, but he wasn't a suspect. He was Lieutenant Jockson, a decorated cop. 31 years of service gone in a glance. How did everything he earned vanish that fast? Let's watch until the end. It happened in seconds. No warning, no questions, no context. A squad car came skidding into the park, tires grinding against loose gravel. Before the birds had finished their morning songs, before the sun had fully warmed the benches, 3 young officers had rushed out with hands hovering over their weapons and sharp voices slicing through the calm air. Stop right there. Hands where we can see them. Now. Jockson had just finished his 3rd mile. His sweatshirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat. He was catching his breath beneath an old tree, palms resting on his thighs, his heart still pounding from the run. But that pounding now had nothing to do with exercise. His body froze. Not out of guilt, not out of fear, out of something deeper. Recognition. He had trained officers like these. He had led raids, cracked high-profile cases, faced men with guns and nothing to lose. He'd walked into meth labs, talked down armed suspects, and once, during a bank standoff, offered to swap himself for a child hostage. They didn't know that. They didn't ask. They didn't see a lieutenant. They saw a black man in a hoodie alone at sunrise, standing too still in a place he was assumed not to belong. I'm Lieutenant Jockson, he said slowly, voice firm but even. 7th Precinct, badge number 0421. My ID is in my pocket. One officer motioned to the others. They didn't even glance at the pocket. The second officer yanked his arms behind his back. Cold steel clicked shut around his wrists. You can confirm it, Jockson added, jaw tight. Call dispatch. But no one reached for a radio. They pushed him down onto a bench. The same bench he had sat on for nearly 15 years after morning runs, sipping coffee from the corner cart, waving to regulars. No one seemed to notice that this man, now bent over, cuffed, and silent, had once stood in front of bullets to protect this city. People had called him the ghost in his early years on the force, not because he was invisible, but because of how he worked quietly, thoroughly, appearing at crime scenes with intuition that seemed almost supernatural. He solved cold cases others gave up on. He had cracked the Dawson kidnapping, the Rivera double homicide, the 11-month Westwood drug ring. His name showed up in debriefings, in courtrooms, in community meetings where mothers wept and thanked him for bringing peace, or at least answers. But none of that mattered now. He was just a man in sweats, breathing hard, in the wrong place with the wrong skin. As they patted him down, a small laminated card slipped from his waistband. It hit the pavement, landing face up. His precinct photo stared back at them. Lieutenant, awards in the background, city seal gleaming in the upper corner. One officer bent down, picked it up. He froze. Sir, he muttered, glancing back at the others. I think we made a mistake. Before the others could respond, a voice cut through the crowd. Deeper, older, unshaken. You didn't make a mistake, the man said. You made an assumption. It was Chief Rowland, retired now but impossible to forget. Towering, white-haired, once the most respected figure in city law enforcement and Jockson's grandfather. He had trained generations of officers, built reforms into the system before reform was a buzzword, and had personally pinned Jockson's badge on his chest the day he made lieutenant. He held up an old leather case, the city crest still visible through the scuffs. This is my grandson, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He's bled for this city more times than you've tied your boots, and yet here we are. Silence rippled through the park. The officers moved quickly now, apologizing as they removed the cuffs. One mumbled something about a complaint from a jogger. Another said they were just following protocol. But protocol never explained why no one checked his ID. Protocol never felt this humiliating. Jockson stood. He didn't lash out. He didn't curse or threaten lawsuits. That would have been easier. What he did instead was look each officer in the eye. I've walked into gang hideouts, he said quietly, negotiated with men high out of their minds and holding knives to strangers. And not once have I been treated with as little trust as I was right here, in a city I protected for half my life. He turned, nodded to his grandfather, and walked away without another word. Behind him, murmurs floated through the air. A teenager asked his mother, was he really a cop? A jogger shook his head, embarrassed. One officer rubbed his wrist, as if he could feel the cuffs too. That day didn't end with sirens. No news trucks. No press conference. Just a man walking home slower than usual. Not from fatigue, but from something heavier. And that, perhaps, is the tragedy. That a man could carry decades of honor in his heart, a badge in his wallet, and the respect of an entire city in his name, yet still be brought to his knees by a glance that saw only the surface. Some battles are fought in gunfire, others in silence. Jockson had won the first kind all his life. Now he had spent his life walking into danger while others ran from it. For 31 years, Jockson had stood in courtrooms, back alleys, rooftops, and neighborhoods. Most officers didn't drive through without backup. He didn't just survive the job, he transformed it. The kind of cop whose name quietly echoed through precincts, not for politics or promotion, but for results. For justice delivered with calm hands and clear eyes. For honor that didn't need a podium. But all of that was invisible that morning. He was in the park, cooling down after a sunrise run, wiping sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his sweatshirt. The sky was glowing soft orange through the branches, and the quiet hum of the city's breath had just begun. He paused by the bench, same as always, bent to retie a stubborn shoelace, feeling the warmth of exertion still pulsing in his chest. Then came the sound. A short siren chirped shrill, abrupt, slicing the calm in two. Before he could stand up straight, they were already there. 3 officers. New faces. Young, tight-bodied, high-strung. Their movements were sharp, rehearsed, automatic. One flanked left, another mirrored. The third kept his hand low, resting too close to the handle of his weapon. Step away from the bench, let me see your hands. Jockson turned slowly, raising his hands with the patience of someone who'd walked others through this moment far too many times. His voice, when it came, was controlled, composed. Lieutenant Jockson, 7th Precinct, badge number 0421. My ID is in my left pocket. No response. No verification. No pause. One officer stepped forward without hesitation. The cuffs came out fast, practiced, cold. Jockson didn't flinch. He didn't argue. His instincts told him not to. Not here. Not now. Not when the air was thick with assumption, and the eyes facing him were already locked into a story that had nothing to do with truth. His arms were yanked back. The steel bit down on his wrists. They pressed him against the bench. Knees bent, palms scraped against worn iron. Gravel dug into his skin. The smell of his own sweat suddenly turned sour. It wasn't the first time he'd worn cuffs, but it was the first time they had ever been placed on him. From behind, he heard one of them mutter, "We got a call. Blackmail. Loitering near the North Trail. Could be casing." That was all it took. No further detail, no context. Just a race, and a place, and a rhythmless equation. Black plus hoodie plus early morning equals probable cause. They didn't look at the ID that had fallen from his pocket during the scuffle. His precinct photo lay face up in the dirt. They didn't call dispatch. They didn't ask his name again. Because in their minds, his identity had already been decided. It wasn't the cuffs that hurt most. It was the silence of every principle he had lived by being shattered by the very system he swore to protect. The silence of not being asked, not being seen, not being believed. He had trained officers like them, taught seminars on field engagement, instructed cadets on situational awareness, community policing, threat assessment. He had poured decades of wisdom into shaping better judgment. But that morning, they didn't see a mentor or a protector. They saw only a profile, a silhouette, a skin tone against a park bench. People started to gather. A woman stopped mid-stride, phone rising slowly. A jogger muttered, confused. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve. The stillness of dawn shifted into something electric, uncomfortable. And And then, just as the air turned heavy, came the voice. Uncuff him. It cracked through the moment like thunder. The tone of command was unmistakable. The voice of a man who didn't repeat himself. Chief Rowland stepped forward, his silver hair catching the light, his old badge case open in one hand like a warning. That man is my grandson, he said, voice low but fierce. Lieutenant Samuel Jockson. Commendations in hostage negotiation, narcotics investigation, community reform. You just arrested the man who cleaned up your city while you were still in high school. The officers froze, color drained, radios buzzed to life, fingers scrambled for verification they should have reached for 10 minutes earlier. The cuffs came off. Apologies were stammered, eyes darting everywhere except to meet Jockson's. But he didn't move right away. He stood there, rubbing his wrists, slow and deliberate. His gaze met each of theirs, not with fire but with something quieter, more dangerous. Disappointment. You didn't fail because you acted fast, he said, voice measured, almost soft. You failed because you didn't think. You didn't ask. You looked at me and saw a threat because you couldn't imagine I might be one of your own. Then he walked away, past the bench, past the phone cameras, past the crowd that had grown too quiet to pretend they hadn't seen. No press release would follow. No headlines would rage. No one would tell this story on the evening news. But in Jockson's heart, something permanent had shifted. Not rage, not revenge, something worse. The quiet realization that even after 3 decades of service, valor, and sacrifice, the color of his skin still had the power to erase all he had done. The betrayal was not just personal, it was institutional. Because that morning the law didn't forget him. It refused to see him at all. The wounds of the second, the metal of the handcuffs was still warm from his skin. Jockson sat on the edge of the park bench, wrists bound behind him, sweat drying cold on the back of his neck. Around him, the world spun forward like nothing had happened. Joggers passed. A child threw crumbs to birds. The buzz of a phone camera hummed quietly in the background. 3 officers stood nearby, exchanging clipped words and sidelong glances. They hadn't called it in. They hadn't verified anything. They had followed a suspicion, not a fact, not a name, not a badge. Jockson had offered his ID the moment they approached. Calm, direct, professional. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't resist. But none of it had mattered. In that moment, 31 years of service meant less than 30 seconds of skin-deep judgment. And still, he didn't rage. Instead, he lifted his chin and spoke with quiet precision. May I make a phone call? One officer paused. To who? My emergency contact, Jockson replied. He'll vouch for me. The officer glanced at the others, then gave a reluctant nod. Jockson tilted his head toward his phone, which had fallen nearby. They retrieved it, held it out to his ear. He dialed from memory. 2 rings. Then a voice picked up, low, weathered, unmistakably calm. Granddad, Jockson said, steady as ever. They've got me cuffed at Fremont Park. I told them who I was. They didn't check. A pause. I see, said the voice. The call ended. Jockson looked straight ahead, his breath even, his expression unreadable. 10 minutes passed. Then came a sound no one expected. Not sirens, not shouting, just the sound of footsteps, measured, firm, deliberate, like each step was a verdict. From the far end of the path, a man appeared. He didn't walk like someone unsure of where he was going. He walked like someone whose name was already written in the ground he stepped on. A dark wool coat, neatly buttoned, trousers pressed so sharp they caught the light, a cap held in one hand, and in the other a polished badge case, aged but gleaming with a city seal that had once commanded entire departments. Chief Rowland. Retired, yes, but his presence had not retired. Neither had his discipline, or the unmistakable air of authority that followed him like a shadow. He said nothing at first, just walked slowly, eyes scanning every face in the crowd. Not out of confusion, out of quiet judgment. He reached the officers like a wave that couldn't be stopped. They straightened instinctively, though they didn't yet know why. Finally, his voice broke the silence. I understand you have my grandson in cuffs. One of the officers cleared his throat. Sir, we were responding to a report of a suspicious individual, black male, gray hoodie, lingering by the benches. We were following protocol. Roland interrupted, voice flat. The officer hesitated. Roland stepped closer. You followed a call, but you didn't follow sense. You ignored identification. You ignored the name he gave you. You didn't verify. You reacted. He turned toward Jockson, who remained seated, quiet, his eyes fixed on his grandfather. This man is Lieutenant Samuel Jockson, Roland continued. 7th Precinct, decorated, respected, trusted. The man who broke the Park Ridge trafficking case when no one else could. The man who carried a child out of a burning house on the south side and didn't wait to be thanked. The man who's worn a badge longer than any of you have held a driver's license. Silence returned. The officers' faces had lost color. One moved awkwardly toward the cuffs. Unfasten them, Roland said, calm but final. Blake. Jockson stood, slowly, rubbed his wrists, then exhaled. The weight wasn't from the metal. It was from something deeper, something that didn't leave bruises, but left scars. He didn't speak immediately. Then he turned to the officers, looking at each of them not with anger, but with a sadness that could split stone. You didn't see a lieutenant. You saw a problem. I asked for one thing, a pause, a moment, a question, and you gave me none of it. He looked down at his own hands, then back to them. I put this badge on every day to stop things like this from happening. But I see now, the uniform doesn't make you see clearer. It just makes your mistakes more visible. The crowd had gone silent. Even the birds seemed to wait. Jockson walked toward his grandfather, who gave a slight nod and turned with him. Side by side, they exited the park the way only legends do, without noise, without explanation, only presence. Behind them, the world had to reckon with itself, and none of it would ever look quite the same again. He walked home slower than usual that morning. There were no cuffs on his wrists anymore, but his hands still remembered their pressure. His shoulders still held the weight of eyes that had looked through him, not at him. His name had been cleared. His record untouched, but nothing about him felt intact. Jockson didn't say much after his grandfather had walked him out of the park. Chief Roland had offered to take him home, had suggested they get coffee, or just sit for a while, but Jockson had declined. Not because he didn't need company, but because he didn't know what he'd say. How do you explain the kind of hurt that doesn't bruise? How do you describe being erased while standing completely still? He had faced death before. That kind of fear was sharp and fast, like glass breaking in your chest. But this pain was different. This one settled in quietly. It sank beneath his skin like a shadow and made a home in places no medicine could reach. When he got home, he sat in the hallway for a long time. Just Saturday shoes still on, jacket half unzipped. His apartment was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't comfort but exposed. He looked at the framed photo on the wall near his door. Him in uniform, flanked by 2 kids from a neighborhood he used to patrol every week. They'd surprised him with a handmade thank you card after he helped their father find work again. Jockson remembered that day like it was stitched into his skin. He remembered believing that kindness could ripple through a city if you were just consistent enough, careful enough, human enough. And yet, this morning, none of that had mattered. No one had seen the man in that photo. They had seen someone else. A threat, a mistake, a target. He walked into the kitchen, took a glass down, then put it back up. His hands weren't steady. His thoughts kept folding in on themselves. Did I speak too fast? Should I have just waited longer? Should I have raised my voice? No, that would have been worse. You know better. You know how that goes. He had trained officers on this very scenario. De-escalation, recognition, bias, interruption. The irony now felt unbearable. It was like watching a house you had built brick by brick burn down with your name still carved into the foundation. He opened a drawer, pulled out the worn leather case that held his badge. It still shone, though the corners were dulled with time. He remembered the first time he held it. The weight had felt sacred, as if it meant something more than authority. It had meant trust. It had meant responsibility. He placed it on the counter gently, like an offering. Then he Saturday. He didn't cry, not the way people think of crying. There were no sobs, no shaking, just the kind of stillness that only comes when something inside you has gone painfully, impossibly quiet. He thought about every mother he had spoken to after a traffic stop gone wrong. Every father who said, "My boy's a good kid," with pleading eyes. He thought about every time he said the words, "It's gonna be okay," and wondered now if he had really believed them. Because today, he wasn't the one comforting. Today, he was the example. He was the man in the hoodie by the bench. He was the man who followed all the rules and still ended up on his knees. And he realized this wasn't about that morning. This had been waiting beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to show its face again. The system didn't crack today. It simply revealed the fracture that had always been there. What hurt most wasn't that they didn't know who he was. It was that they didn't care enough to ask. That, even after 31 years, he had been stripped down to nothing more than an outline. Not a man, not a veteran, not a protector, just a shadow on a bench. His phone buzzed. Messages poured in. His precinct, the mayor's office. A captain he hadn't spoken to in months, all expressing concern, some shock. A few apologies that read like legal statements dressed up in empathy. He didn't answer. Because what they didn't understand, what they probably never would, was that this wasn't about the mistake. It was about the meaning of silence, the meaning of humiliation absorbed in public and processed alone, the meaning of being good, being great even, and still never being seen as enough. That morning rewrote something inside of him. It didn't turn him bitter. He wouldn't give the world that satisfaction, but it made him quieter, sharper, more aware of how thin the line was between respect and rejection, between recognition and removal, between wearing a badge and becoming a suspect. And in that silence, something crystallized, a truth he had always known but had hoped would change in time. Being excellent would never be enough to protect him from being profiled. Being good would never be loud enough to drown out fear. And justice, real justice, would never be possible until people stopped needing proof that someone deserved dignity. Jackson picked up his badge one last time, stared at it, and placed it gently back into the drawer. Then he stood, straightened his back, and walked back into the quiet. Because some wounds don't bleed, but they break you just the same. Sometimes, the most painful moments in life don't come from violence or hatred. They come from being unseen. Jackson's story isn't about a mistake. It's about what happens when good people are reduced to assumptions, when a lifetime of service can be erased in one glance, when a man who risked everything for his community finds himself handcuffed by the very system he protected, not because of what he did, but because of what he looked like in a sweatshirt on an ordinary morning. This story reminds us that dignity isn't something we should have to earn. It's something we all deserve simply because we are human. It calls us to reflect on how quickly we draw conclusions, how little we sometimes listen, and how powerful it is to pause, to ask, to verify, to look deeper. Jackson did everything right. He stayed calm. He identified himself. He followed the rules. And yet, he walked away with a wound no one could see, a wound shaped like silence, like disappointment, like betrayal. But within that pain lies a mirror that asks each of us, do we really see the people around us? Not just their clothes, their age, their color, but their story, their humanity, their right to be treated with care and respect. This isn't just a story about policing. It's about how we treat each other in everyday moments. It's about the quiet choices that add up to a society. It's about the courage to slow down and look again, to build systems that don't just react, but remember who they're meant to serve. At its heart, this is a story about character. The character of a man who didn't raise his voice even when he had every reason to. The character of a grandfather who stood up not just for his blood, but for what is right. And the character we are all called to develop, one that chooses empathy over assumption, listening over judgment, and love over fear. Because without character, justice is just a word. Without compassion, rules are just noise. And without seeing each other clearly, we become blind to what matters most. So here's our gentle invitation to you. Let Jockson's story stay with you, not as a sad tale, but as a reason to be better, to think a second longer before acting, to speak with kindness, to honor the quiet dignity of others. That's how real change begins, not from headlines, but from heart lines. And if this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or pause for just a moment, we invite you to join us. Subscribe to our channel to hear more real stories that carry real lessons. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if something about Jockson's journey resonates with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But most importantly, take this with you into the world. Every person you pass has a story you don't know. Treat them like it matters. Thank you for spending this time with us. And wherever you are, whatever you're facing, we wish you peace, clarity, and a day filled with goodness. Stay kind, stay human. We'll see you in the next story.